Hello friends, welcome back to the next session on operations planning, scheduling and control. Now let's begin with our learning. In this particular session, we'll be dealing with the concept of facilitating the offline setup. The learning objectives. At the end of this particular session, the learners will be able to understand how do we define or what do we mean by facilitating the offline setup, what are the various activities that are being implemented or been undertaken in terms of facilitating the offline setup, and describe the facilitating offline setup activities that have been conducted in the organization. Now let's begin with our learning at this particular stage. Initially, let's understand what do we mean by facilitating the offline setup. In terms of facilitating the offline setup, it begins at the top level management, the middle level management, and the low level management. So, in a particular organization, when all the series of activities are being undertaken, the work culture that is been defining or promoting in an organization always differs which type of communication is being prevailing, whether there is an open communication or whether there is a closed communication. Depending on sharing of knowledge, depending on the team position in a certain company, it differs from the offline setup that is there. In terms of an organization, when there is a certain consideration where people has to work physically on a particular setup, the facilities that are available, the facility as to communication, the facility as to resources, the facility as to healthy knowledge and environment, and so on. The team position also plays a very crucial or important role, where one has to understand about what role each and every member of the team is being playing. The next important perspective is the culture of the organization. In terms of the culture, which will eventually reflect the success in the today's business, is of critical importance. So here, in this particular session, we'll understand how do we facilitate the offline setup in a particular organization so as to see that the employees in the organization are quite happy, beneficial and service oriented to deliver the qualitative service in the organization. And hence, facilitating the offline setup is essentially important. Now, what are the various practical tips that facilitate the collaboration? The number one, that is keep everyone on the same page. So if we want our organization to be in a successful way and lead greater results to the organization, then everyone in the organization, that is all the employees, should be kept on the same page. So equal treatment for all is essentially required, and accordingly, whether it is a male or a female, whether it is an adult or an old age person, whether he's a knowledgeable or unknowledgeable, whether he's unexperienced or a certain fresher, everyone should be kept on the same page, and accordingly the balance or equity should be provided in order to see that the facilities or the collaboration is in the offline setup is quite healthy and fruitful. Creating a culture of psychological safety. In this case, a psychological safety is essentially important for a particular individual, wherein it focuses on the concept of how the organization is looking for the psychology or tendency of a particular individual. The psychological safety as to the increase or decrease in the setup of a certain organization, the healthy or work conditions or the environment in the organizations, and so on. So creating a work culture which treats a certain organization as a part of an homely nature or a home culture is essentially important. Leading by example. In this case, everyone that is working in a team or everyone working in a group should be given equal opportunity, wherein everyone should lead by an example and should show that or portray themselves that they are doing the best. So whatever job or the task that has been assigned to an individual, everyone should complete that particular job or task in an effective way, and they should have a certain leading example about how those particular tasks can be completed in a better, efficient way. Human and slip from time to time. So here in this case, there are certain activities with the human error or with the limitations of a human being may be conducted in the specified time period or may be slipping from the time to time. So a proper close consideration or the nature with respect to how practical tips can be implemented is everyone should have a proper watch on the activities, and accordingly we need to observe that whatever time that is being utilized, whatever activities that have been conducted are not slipping from the hand. So every minute or every hour of the organization should be utilized very effectively, and accordingly there should be a proper resource allocation in the organization. The candid feedback. Ultimately, whenever a particular task or a certain activity is being completed and when it is of a fruitful nature, then accordingly the candid feedback of the individual needs to be undertaken. And for those particular consideration, the candid feedback is essentially important. The feedback from the peers, the feedback from the members, the feedback from the managers, subordinates, group members is essentially important. And those particular feedback should be shared with everyone so that the other members of the team or the group also learn from those considerations. And hence, the feedback is essentially required. developing a financial strategy. Now, let's understand how do we develop a financial strategy when we identify the offline setup that has been there in the organization. So, certain activities that have been conducted in the business organization are at stages of a certain important nature or of a certain importance at a gradual stage. In a certain operational excellences activities that have been undertaken, everyone needs to plan the finances. That is, the finance that has been required for a short-term period, for a long-term period, and so on. And hence, enhancing the operational activities and expanding the business is essentially required, or it is essentially important. So, quantity as well as quality matters at all the stages. And when it comes to the financial strategic perspective, one has to see that the finance that is available is of a qualitative nature as well as the quantitative nature. Probably where one is looking for a strategic business movement position, one has to improve the margins as well as keep them in a consistent position. The consistency in the amount of revenue in terms of profit always needs to be identified, and one has to see that those particular profits are always at an increasing stage. The margin with respect to the profit, the margin as to the sales, everything should be in a balanced position, and accordingly the consistency in the strategies needs to be designed. However, there are certain strategies which are also termed as tried and true strategies, which help the organization to develop their professional service businesses. These particular business services are of a professional nature, wherein they are always specific and target oriented. That is, for a specific time period, how those particular activities can be completed and in what time duration those particular targets are being met or not. And hence, for those particular consideration, the tried and true strategies are essentially important. But in today's service economy scenario, when there is a prevailing competition into the market, one has to see that whenever we are deciding on the effective implementation of strategy, that strategy should be quite effective and should bring a complex nature. The increasingly complex nature of a particular strategy is essentially important, which focuses on how those business activities can be completed and be complied as and when the need arises. And hence, the fruitfulness or the productivity of the organization as a part of a concern should be effectively implemented. Now let's understand what are the various challenges in measuring the operational efficiency. The major challenges in measuring the operational efficiency are related to the vague concept, the overflowing with the data which is scattered, the missing connections as to how they progressed things in the real time, the most stolid and the watchful operation, the real-time visibility which is not possible, and lastly, the comprehensive real-time information which is not possible. The vague concept. So in case of an offline setup which is into existence, the concept may be either vague or the concept may be either acceptable. Depending on the number of people which are into existence or in the line organization, the concept may be either accepted or it may be denied by the individual. And hence, the concept should always be very specific and it acts as a challenge in measuring the operational efficiency. Overflowing with the data that has been scattered. So, always the data that is available in the organization is always of a scattered nature. And in order to see that the data is always properly well organized and in a proper sequence or a situation, the overflowing of data should be avoided. Missing connections between the things that progress in the real time. So always the connection that is there into existence, always one has to see that there is no missing link that has been created in the communication process and there is a proper channel or flow of activities in the real time situation. The most solid and the watchful operation. So operations which are of a in terms of the job shop or the flow actually in a similar situation which have a red color line or a red flow of activity which is of the primary importance should have a stolid and watchful operation. So accordingly, activities which are of a prime importance should be carefully watched and accordingly proper information and control on all those activities needs to be ascertained. The real-time visibility is not possible. So in certain cases, it has been observed that the real-time visibility and checking of results is not possible when the activities are being conducted in a sequential way. So proper monitoring of activities is essentially required and the monitoring of those activities needs to be from a micro perspective. And lastly, comprehensive real-time information visibility. Whenever a particular manager or a superior feels that such certain amount of information visibility needs to be checked or it needs to be assessed, so at that particular stage, the comprehensive real-time information should be made available to each and every individual or the participants of the operational chain. And hence, for those particular considerations, if the such information is not available, there is lag in the decision making that can be undertaken in the organization. And hence, these are the various challenges which affect the operational efficiency that can be maintained in the organization. Now let's understand how do we remove or deal with the impediments to the data flow and analysis. So in this particular case, one can implement a certain color coding techniques. So whenever a particular data that has been organized or is been created in a spreadsheet, all those particular data can be colored with respect to their importance. That is, based on their priority, based on their importance, a certain color codes can be provided with those particular activities. In this particular case, a certain numericals, a certain diagrams, or a certain charts, or a certain symbols can be given for those particular consideration, which is of a primary importance, secondary importance, or of the tertiary, that is the least importance. Arrange in another case, there may be another type of stumbling blocks that can be created in an organization. Those particular stumbling blocks may either be beneficial, that is fruitful, or they may be unfruitful to the organization, which involves the additional administrative labor. Now, when additional amount of spreadsheet or some stumbling blocks have been observed in a certain organization or certain operational level, then those create a certain amount of concern with respect to the time consumption of an individual or increase in the payroll situation. So, for those particular consideration, the spreadsheet that we are preparing, it should be of a fragmented nature, it should be divided, and accordingly it should be also self-explanatory. The resource management perspective is essentially important, which helps to identify about what resources one is using, what is the employment or deployment of those particular resources, and how far those particular resources will be helpful in the organization. And hence, a proper movement or sequence of flow of activities in the organization needs to be analyzed, and those particular impediments or hurdles in the data flow and analysis should be removed. So in a particular case, when we are looking for an offline setup, it is necessary to see that in a professional industry, the future of operations is always to look at the cost cutting as the major perspective, wherein a particular individual working for a certain period or a certain time period should always be focusing on a certain amount of activity, and the resources that has been allocated or the job that has been allocated is been completed within the specified time period. For this particular consideration, the various booklets or the spreadsheet needs to be prepared, and accordingly, the sustainability of those particular intelligences needs to be identified. And lastly, one has to understand that how work automation activities can be conducted in a certain organization. So fine tuning of those particular operational activities in order to see that the synergy of the employees or the organization is being utilized and it creates a benefit for the organization in the long run. And hence the optimum utilization of resources is essentially required, and accordingly one has to be on their toes to match all those sequences. Now let's summarize what we have learned in this particular session. In this particular session, the learners have understood what do we mean by facilitating the offline setup, what are the various techniques that can be implemented for managing the offline setup, and accordingly how do we implement the offline setup in a certain organization. I hope you must have enjoyed the learning at this particular stage. Thank you for your patience listening. Thank you.